Americans can't fight in snow. That was the joke, whispered in German command tents, written in reports, repeated with laughter over steaming mugs of coffee. The Americans, they said, were soft, spoiled by comfort, weak in the cold, lost without their supply lines. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit. What did they know of winter war? And for a moment, they were right. The Ardennes forest was silent that December morning. White, frozen, waiting. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. The Germans believed they had outsmarted the enemy. They had chosen the terrain, the timing, the weather itself as their ally. But the snow had other plans. Because in the end, the snow doesn't care who laughs first, only who's left standing when it melts. The Quiet Deception. December 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched across the border between Belgium and Luxembourg like a forgotten corner of the world. Dense woodlands, rolling hills, narrow roads that twisted through valleys where morning fog clung like ghosts to the earth. It was beautiful in its desolation, the kind of beauty that makes men forget they're at war. Both sides had grown comfortable with assumptions. The Americans believed the Germans were finished. After the Normandy invasion, after the liberation of Paris, after months of steady Allied advance, victory seemed inevitable. The war would be over by Christmas, they told each other, maybe by spring at the latest. In the Ardennes, exhausted divisions rested and regrouped. Green recruits trained in relative quiet. Veterans wrote letters home, counting the days until they could leave this frozen hell behind. The Germans, meanwhile, prepared their final gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine. Adolf Hitler stood over maps in his underground bunker, his hands trembling slightly as he traced lines through the Ardennes with a finger. Around him, generals shifted uncomfortably. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, a massive winter offensive designed to split the Allied lines, drive to Antwerp, cut off British and Canadian forces, and force a negotiated peace. It was desperation dressed as strategy. Germany was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, her cities in ruins, her armies retreating on all fronts, but Hitler believed in the power of the unexpected blow, the lightning strike that could reverse fortune itself. They won't expect it, he insisted, not in winter, not through the Ardennes. His generals knew better than to argue too loudly. Some believed, most simply obeyed. But there was something else in those command tents, something more dangerous than desperation. There was mockery. There was contempt. "The Americans," one officer said over schnapps, "they're not soldiers, they're tourists in uniform." Another laughed. "They panic when their supply trucks are late. What will they do when the shells start falling?" "They can't fight in snow," someone added, and the room erupted in agreement. It was confidence built on quicksand, a mixture of propaganda, desperation, and selective memory. They forgot that Americans had learned to fight in North Africa's heat, in Italy's mountains, across France's hedgerows. They forgot that underestimating one's enemy is the oldest mistake in war. But belief is a powerful narcotic. It dulls the senses, it blinds the mind to inconvenient truths. The German High Command saw what they wanted to see, a soft American army, dependent on logistics, vulnerable to shock. They calculated fuel requirements optimistically. They assumed weather would favor them. They planned to capture American supply depots to sustain their advance. Confidence is a soldier's armor until it turns into blindness. The seeds of reckoning. History has a pattern. Napoleon marched into Russia believing in his invincibility, in the superiority of French tactics and will. The Russian winter taught him otherwise. At Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht believed Soviet resistance would crumble under pressure. The frozen city became their tomb. Now, in December 1944, another army prepared to learn the same lesson. On the American side, there was complacency of a different kind. Intelligence reports suggested unusual German activity, but command dismissed it. Why would the Germans attack here, through difficult terrain, in winter, when they were already losing? It made no strategic sense. A young lieutenant wrote home, "It's strange how quiet everything is, almost peaceful, like the war forgot about us for a while." The quiet was deceptive. In the German positions, 250,000 men prepared to attack. Tanks were camouflaged under netting. Artillery pieces were positioned in the forests. Supplies, inadequate but deemed sufficient, were stockpiled. Officers synchronized watches and studied maps by candlelight. The Americans across the lines played cards, heated rations, complained about the cold. Some thought about Christmas, others simply tried to stay warm. Every war ends the same way, with someone who thought they couldn't lose. The calendar marked December 15th. In a few hours, the Ardennes would erupt. The joke about Americans and snow would be tested, and the forest would remember what men too often forget. Nature is indifferent to flags, to strategies, to pride. The snow continued to fall, silent and steady, blanketing everything in white. Thunder in the Forest. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The darkness exploded. Artillery shells tore through the frozen air, hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, a rolling barrage that shattered the winter silence. Trees splintered, earth erupted, the ground itself seemed to scream. American positions disintegrated under the onslaught. Men woke to apocalypse, their foxholes collapsing, their tents shredded, their world transformed in seconds from quiet cold to roaring chaos. Radio communications went dead. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the thunder of incoming shells. The Ardennes had become a graveyard of assumptions. The flood begins. As dawn broke gray and bitter, German infantry poured through the forest. Behind them, tanks, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, ground forward along the narrow roads. The offensive stretched across an 80-mile front, three armies driving west with furious momentum. In some sectors, American units broke immediately. Green troops, never tested in combat, simply ran. Officers found themselves commanding phantoms as their men vanished into the woods. Equipment was abandoned. Positions surrendered without a fight. German commanders radioed success. The breakthrough was working. The Americans were fleeing. "Just as we predicted," an officer said, allowing himself a smile. "They can't handle shock. They're collapsing." For 48 hours, it seemed the arrogance might be justified. German spearheads penetrated 30 miles into American territory. Entire battalions surrendered. Supply depots fell. The strategic town of St. Vith was surrounded. Roads clogged with American vehicles retreating westward. The snow seemed to favor the attackers. It concealed their movements, grounded Allied aircraft, disrupted communications. Nature, it appeared, had chosen a side. Nature's betrayal. But snow is loyal to no one. By the third day, the weather that had aided surprise became something else entirely. The temperature plummeted. The snow intensified. Not gentle flakes, but driving sheets that reduced visibility to meters. Wind howled through the forests, a savage, unrelenting force that cut through uniforms and flesh alike. The German advance began to slow. Fuel became scarce. The optimistic calculations in warm command rooms hadn't accounted for reality. Supply trucks struggled through deepening snow. Promised fuel depots either didn't exist or had been destroyed by Americans retreating. Tanks began running dry, their engines coughing into silence. Without fuel, the panzers became monuments. Crews sat inside frozen steel coffins, waiting for orders that couldn't reach them, because radios were failing in the cold. Arrogance isn't destroyed by bullets, it's erased by silence.
The disintegration. You can trace the collapse in the details, the small moments that accumulate into catastrophe. A German soldier tries to start his motorcycle. The engine refuses. He kicks it in frustration, breaks his toe against frozen metal. Now he can't walk properly, becomes a burden. A supply column takes a wrong turn in the blizzard, drives for hours before realizing they're lost. By the time they find the correct route, their cargo, food, ammunition, medical supplies, is desperately late. Men at the front go hungry, wounded die waiting. Radios fail because batteries freeze. Officers send runners with messages, but runners get lost in the whiteout conditions, or are killed by American patrols, or simply freeze to death between positions. The snow isolates everyone. Units lose contact with command. Commanders lose track of their units. The offensive becomes 1,000 separate struggles, each formation fighting blind, wondering where the others are, whether the plan still exists. German soldiers, so confident days before, begin to understand what the snow really is. It isn't an ally, it's a tyrant. It doesn't discriminate. It kills whoever isn't prepared, whoever has inadequate supplies, whoever believes they can bend it to their will. Half-buried corpses mark the routes of advance, German and American both, frozen in the positions where they fell, expressions locked in final surprise. The snow covers them all equally, indifferent to nationality. But something else was happening. The Americans, supposedly soft and pampered, were adapting. After the initial shock, after the panic and retreat, something harder emerged. Small unit commanders took charge when senior officers were killed or captured. Isolated groups formed defensive positions and held them with desperate determination. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and supporting units found themselves completely surrounded. German forces cut every road. Artillery pounded the town relentlessly. Supplies dwindled to nothing. Medical facilities overflowed with wounded. The cold killed as efficiently as bullets. German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum: yield or be annihilated. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a single word: nuts. The German officers who received the reply were confused. They had to have it explained that this was American slang for an unequivocal refusal. The idea that surrounded, outnumbered, freezing men would reject the logical option of surrender seemed to perplex them. But logic has little to do with war once blood is spilled. If this is where we die, let's make it cost them everything, one paratrooper said. Around Bastogne, American forces held. At St. Vith, they delayed the German advance for days beyond what should have been possible. Along the northern shoulder of the Bulge, divisions that were supposed to collapse instead formed a wall that wouldn't break. The joke about Americans in snow was becoming something else, a lesson about underestimating desperate men. The breathing forest. There were moments between the chaos when everything stopped. Mornings when artillery fell silent and the only sound was wind through frozen branches. Evenings when both sides huddled in foxholes, too cold and exhausted to fight, just trying to survive until dawn. In these pauses, you could almost hear the forest itself breathing, the trees, the snow, the ancient earth that had witnessed countless human follies and would witness countless more. Nature doesn't participate in war. It simply continues, indifferent to the small, violent creatures who think themselves masters of fate. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We thought the cold would break them, but I think it might break us first." Pride can command armies, but only humility survives winters. The mathematics of collapse. By December 22nd, the offensive had stalled. Not stopped by a single dramatic defeat, but eroded by 1,000 small failures. Fuel trucks that never arrived, ammunition that ran out, food supplies exhausted, wounded who couldn't be evacuated, frostbite casualties mounting until entire companies were combat ineffective. The snow had turned from ally to executioner. German units found themselves trapped by their own success. They had penetrated deep into American territory, but now those extended positions were vulnerable, exposed, difficult to supply. The wedge they'd driven into Allied lines became a trap, easier to cut off than to reinforce. Maps in German headquarters showed the offensive's progress as a bulge pushing west. It looked impressive on paper, but the officers studying those maps knew the truth. The bulge was hollow. It had no strength behind it. It was momentum without resources, ambition without means. Hitler demanded continued attack. His generals explained, with increasing desperation, that continued attack was impossible. The men were exhausted. The tanks were immobile. The supply situation was catastrophic. "Then they must fight with what they have," Hitler insisted, his voice rising. "The Americans are on the verge of breaking. One more push." But it was the Germans who were breaking. Bastogne, the anvil. The surrounded Americans at Bastogne became the fulcrum of the battle. If the Germans could take the town, they could secure crucial road junctions and resume their advance. If the Americans held, the entire offensive would fail. German forces attacked repeatedly. They threw armor at the defenses. They shelled the town until it was rubble. They probed for weaknesses, looking for any crack in the perimeter. The Americans held. Not through superior numbers or equipment. They were outnumbered and desperately short of supplies. They held through sheer refusal to yield. Wounded men returned to the line. Cooks and clerks picked up rifles. Medics treated patients while under fire, performing surgery in frozen cellars by candlelight. The snow continued falling, indifferent. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through clouds, and with the clear skies came Allied aircraft, transport planes dropping supplies to Bastogne, fighter bombers attacking German positions, reconnaissance planes mapping enemy locations. The Germans, who had prayed for snow to ground the Allied air forces, now watched helplessly as the sky filled with enemies they couldn't reach. It was as if nature itself had switched allegiances. But nature has no allegiance. It simply changes, indifferent to who benefits or suffers. Letters from the void. In abandoned German positions, Americans later found letters, unsent, tucked into pockets, clutched in frozen hands. They told a story of disillusion. "Mother, we were told this would be easy, that the Americans would scatter like sheep, but they fight like cornered wolves, and the cold doesn't care who is right. I no longer believe we will win. I only hope to survive. The snow has taught me that survival is the only victory that matters." They told us Americans couldn't fight in winter,
But we're the ones freezing. We're the ones dying in the snow, far from home, for a cause that feels more distant with every hour. Arrogance has a particular sound when it dies. It's not dramatic. It doesn't roar or explode. It simply goes quiet, like hope freezing slowly in the dark. The counterattack. General George Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army to the south, had been planning for this moment. While other commanders were shocked by the German offensive, Patton saw opportunity. An extended enemy position is also an exposed enemy position. On December 22, Patton's forces wheeled north and struck at the southern flank of the German Bulge. It was one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, an entire army changing direction and attacking within days. The Germans, already overstretched and undersupplied, couldn't respond effectively. Their southern positions crumbled. American armor broke through, driving toward Bastogne. On December 26, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Relief columns pushed through German lines and linked up with the defenders. Supplies flowed into the town. The wounded were evacuated. The isolated garrison was isolated no more. The Bulge began to deflate. The retreat. By early January, the German offensive was in full retreat. The same roads they'd advanced along became routes of escape. Units that had driven west in triumph now stumbled east in defeat, harassed constantly by American artillery and aircraft. The snow that had hidden their approach now exposed their withdrawal. Dark columns of men and vehicles stood out against white landscape. Allied pilots reported target-rich environments. German units caught in the open, unable to hide, unable to defend effectively. The forest that had witnessed their confidence now witnessed their collapse. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel littered the roadways, equipment thrown aside by soldiers too exhausted to carry it anymore. Wounded left behind because there were no vehicles to transport them, no medical supplies to treat them. The soldiers who had laughed about soft Americans now envied those same Americans. Warm and captured German bunkers, fed from steady supply lines, supported by an industrial machine that could sustain war indefinitely. German officers filed reports in numb tones. The casualty figures were staggering. Over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks destroyed or abandoned. Artillery pieces lost. The precious fuel expended for nothing. The offensive designed to change the war's trajectory had instead accelerated Germany's defeat. Silent witnesses. If you had walked through the Ardennes in late January 1945, you would have seen desolation. Forests reduced to shattered stumps, villages destroyed, frozen corpses everywhere, in ditches, in foxholes, sprawled in fields, half buried under snow. The dead didn't look like heroes or villains. They looked like what they were, young men who had frozen or bled to death in a forest far from home, victims of decisions made by others, sacrifices to pride and desperation, and the terrible momentum of war. The snow had begun to melt, revealing everything underneath. The bodies, the equipment, the waste, the truth that winter always reveals when arrogance thaws. Arrogance doesn't die in battle. It freezes slowly, one hope at a time, and when it melts, nothing remains but evidence of folly. The counting. In the weeks after the battle, both sides buried their dead. American graves registration teams worked methodically through the forest, identifying bodies, recording names, preparing them for transport home or for the military cemeteries being established across Europe. German dead were buried where they fell, in mass graves or temporary cemeteries that would later be relocated. Many had no identification. Their families would receive letters, missing in action, presumed dead in the Ardennes. The final toll was brutal. American casualties, nearly 90,000 killed, wounded, or captured, the bloodiest battle in American military history. German casualties, over 100,000, plus the irreplaceable loss of armor, artillery, and supplies that Germany could no longer replace. But numbers don't capture what the Ardennes winter really cost. They don't measure the frostbite that crippled thousands, the psychological wounds that would last lifetimes, the questions that survivors carried forever. Why did we attack? Why did they hold? What was the point? No laughter now, only silence. The historical echo. The Battle of the Bulge, named for the shape it made on maps, became the last major German offensive of World War II. It was Hitler's final gamble, and it failed completely. The resources expended in the Ardennes could have been used to defend Germany itself. Instead, they were wasted on an operation born from desperation and sustained by delusion. 3 months later, Allied armies crossed the Rhine. 4 months later, Hitler was dead in his bunker. 5 months later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Americans who held at Bastogne, who fought in the frozen forests, who survived when they weren't supposed to, they continued east, into the heart of Germany, carrying with them the knowledge that they had endured something remarkable. They had been mocked as soft, as incapable of winter warfare, as tourists in uniform. The snow proved otherwise. Not because Americans were inherently superior, but because war is ultimately decided by endurance, adaptation, and the will to continue when logic suggests surrender. The Germans learned what every empire eventually learns. Contempt for one's enemy is the first step toward defeat. Underestimating opponents doesn't make them weaker, it makes you blind. The universal pattern. Zoom out far enough, and the Ardennes becomes one example of a pattern as old as warfare itself. The Persians underestimated the Greeks at Marathon, believing numbers alone determined victory. The British underestimated the American colonists, thinking rabble couldn't defeat professional soldiers. Napoleon underestimated the Russian winter and the Russian people's willingness to sacrifice. Hitler underestimated the Soviets at Stalingrad, believing ideology made his forces invincible. Every time, the pattern holds. Arrogance blinds. Pride distorts. Contempt creates vulnerability. And every time, those who survive learn the same lesson, though many don't survive long enough to learn it. Every empire believes it can outlast the cold. Every soldier learns otherwise. Final image. The snow fell again the following winter, as it had for centuries before, as it would for centuries after. It covered the scars of battle, the trenches, the shell craters, the makeshift graves. It erased the tracks of tanks and the footprints of soldiers. It made the forest clean and pure again, as if violence had never visited this place. But underneath, the earth remembered. The trees, scarred by shrapnel, carried their wounds into new growth. The ground, soaked in blood, nourished new grass. The stones, pockmarked by bullets, stood as silent witnesses. Veterans who returned decades later walked through the Ardennes in summer warmth, and tried to recognize the places where they had fought, suffered, survived. Most couldn't. The forest had healed. Life had covered death. Time had moved on. But they remembered the cold. They remembered the snow. They remembered what it felt like to be mocked, underestimated, written off, and then to endure anyway, not through superiority, but through simple refusal to quit. And they remembered that winter doesn't care about plans or pride or predictions. It only cares whether you respect it enough to prepare, whether you're humble enough to adapt, whether you're strong enough to endure. In the end, the snow doesn't remember who mocked whom. It only remembers who endured. And when it melts, it reveals the truth that pride always tries to hide. We are all just mortals in the cold, equal before nature's indifference, vulnerable to the same forces, subject to the same lessons. The Ardennes winter of 1944 taught that lesson with brutal clarity. Some learned. Some died without learning. Some tried to teach it to others, hoping the pattern might finally break. But history suggests the pattern never breaks. Each generation must learn again. Each empire must discover its limits. Each winter must humble the proud. The snow will fall again. Somewhere someone will underestimate it. And the old lesson will be taught anew in frozen forests and bloodied snow. Until perhaps humanity finally remembers, arrogance is fragile, humility endures, and the cold bows to no flag.